Boogie woman.
Boogie woman.
Walking down the street, boogie woman. I would not like to meet the boogie woman. Just in case you didn't know, I'm Matthew.
And I'm Brian.
And this is Road Trip Recap. Today we're going to be talking about the pilot episode of Supernatural, so spoilers up ahead.
As well as the urban legends that inspired The Woman in White.
Let's hit the road. The pilot episode opens up in Lawrence, Kansas 22 years ago, so it would be 1983 by their timeline. We see right at the beginning the imagery of a tree reaching for a window of the house. We get a little bit of some forest shadowing. Anyways, we're introduced to Mary and John Winchester, played by Samantha Smith and Jeffrey Dean Morgan, respectively. They decided to start off easy with their first episode by burning Mary alive on the ceiling.
They Disney'd her right off the bat.
Pretty quick. Before we get to that, we see her being awoken by some noise on a baby monitor. She goes to check in on baby Sam and believes she sees John checking in on him as he kind of shushes her. She moves out of the room and sees a light start flickering and just goes to investigate. Now, it seems like just kind of your standard, horror story beginning, but as we learn later on, Mary actually grew up as a hunter, so you would think this would be more of a clue that something really isn't right.
No, they didn't really know that they were going to be going that far with their character at that point in time.
Well, I guess that's what happens when you retcon stuff. Yeah. It doesn't make sense anymore. Mary goes downstairs and sees John sleeping, and now she realizes something definitely isn't right. She runs back upstairs, and then we cut to John being awoken by his wife screaming. He runs upstairs and runs into Sam's room where he presumably heard the scream come from, because once he walks in and doesn't see his wife, he stops looking for her.
She's just having one of her night terrors.
Which, wouldn't he have gone to her room, not the baby's room? But you know what? That doesn't make for good TV, and it just takes away from,
Gotta ratchet up that dramatic tension.
Gotta keep the pacing going.
Yep.
John moves over to look into Sam and has a few drops of blood drip down to make him look up, where he then sees his wife on the ceiling before she bursts into flames. John gives Sam to child Dean and tells him to take Sam outside. This is our first example of Dean kind of being the protector, having to look over his little brother. Side note, after the house bursts into flames and everything, we get a shot of fire department coming in and everything. Back in Lawrence, Kansas in 1983, the fire trucks were actually lime green instead of the fire engine red that were shown.
Huh. Okay.
Cut to present day, we get a good look at our two protagonists, Sam and Dean Winchester, played by Jared Padalecki and Jensen Ackles, respectively. We have to have a quick introduction just to establish what kind of individuals these are. Dean being more of the light-hearted, smart-ass, badass type. All right, Dean's just an ass. Forgot about that.
He's all the ass.
Dean, the ass-chasing, badass, and smart-ass and individual. We get introduced to Sam as the individual that wants to live more of that normal life. He's going to college trying to expand himself the way that everybody else does in a more normal sense, instead of the more warrior lifestyle that he was brought up in. Dean, however, is more of the Han Solo to Sam's Luke Skywalker, which was actually how the character was pitched to Jensen, as he initially read for the part of Sam, and they felt that he would make a better Dean character, just with his personality. Dean requests for Sam's help in helping to find their father, as he had been missing for a while and he's concerned. This is one of the first instances that we also see some variations depending on where you're watching the show. If you're watching it on Netflix, they actually do some editing and they take out certain scenes or certain lines, and I think it's to kind of help with the continuity. In the DVD version, they keep a line in where Dean's talking to Sam and mentions a poltergeist in Amherst and a Devil's Gate in Clifton, which Devil's Gate plays a bigger part in later seasons, so I think Netflix tried to edit that out, presumably. This is also where we get our first look at the trunk of the Impala, and just kind of get established as to what kind of a life these two boys grew up living.
I want that trunk, though.
Yeah. I want this trunk to be like that trunk.
Right.
In the next scene, we move over to Jericho, California, a fictional city for the pilot episode of Supernatural. Here we see an individual driving down a highway, who we later find out is Troy Squire, as he comes across the later to be known as Woman in White. He pulls over to the side of the road and lets her in, and she very sensually asks him to take her home. He agrees, and when they get to the home, she vanishes from the car. He goes to look for her and then gets scared away back into his car as he drives off. She does the reappearing, there's something in the back seat type of theme. He swerves off to the side of the road, and then we cut to a kind of a staple of Supernatural where they don't necessarily show on-screen deaths, but they show kind of the car shaking, a little bit of trouble, and then blood splatters onto the windshield to signify that he has died. We cut back to our protagonists as we learn that they have survived mainly through credit card scams to financially support themselves as they do these hunts all across the country. This also establishes the type of show that is going to be as they establish the type of music that they kind of want in the background with that hard rock feel.
One room, please.
There's also a change up here depending on what you're watching. If you're watching the DVD version, when they throw in the cassette tape, they play AC/DC's Back in Black. They play a completely different song if you're, again, watching it on the Netflix version.
Huh. I wonder what was up with the change. I wonder if they want to use Back in Black later.
I don't know. Our protagonists arrive in Jericho as they see the police investigating the death of Troy Squire. They use some fake badges and pretend to be U.S. Marshals to go ask for more information on what's going on. Here I found it interesting that you get some chatter from the police as they claim that there were no signs of a struggle and that the car was spotless. Almost it was too clean, which I found interesting since blood literally splattered on the windshield. So, I mean, at least the woman in white cleans up after herself.
Maybe ectoplasm can double as bleach.
That's a possibility. In this scene, we get another nod to some of the inspirations for Supernatural as Dean references two of the FBI agents that show up as Mulder and Scully. From here, Sam and Dean track down the girlfriend of Troy Squire as she's hanging up some missing persons posters, and they want to talk to her so they can find some more information. This is also kind of what this show was established originally being about, is urban legends. So it's what people talk about.
What do they talk about?
Here they start to get more of an idea on what they may be dealing with as they learn about the story they get is a woman who was murdered on Centennial Highway, or on the Centennial Bridge. Sam and Dean find out it was actually a suicide as a woman jumped from the bridge, and when they go to investigate, Constance does show up and then jumps off of the bridge while they're there. She then proceeds to possess the Impala and tries to run over Sam and Dean.
A little bit of spirit possession in the very first episode.
And just jumping right into it.
Yep.
From here, Dean needs to get cleaned up after jumping into the river, so they go to get a hotel room where they found out that their father had already paid for a hotel room for an entire month. They break in and see kind of his setup and discover that he had realized that what they were hunting was in fact a woman in white. Dean gets cleaned up and wants to go get something to eat, but the sheriffs have shown up out there, and he warns Sam to get away as he's about to be arrested. From here, we go into Dean's interrogation, where we get one of his first aliases, as when they ask him his name, he refers to himself as Ted Nugent, who is a hard rock guitarist.
I think they might know that he's fibbing.
They do, in fact. As they had gone through John's room, they found his journal, and in there is a note that says Dean with some coordinates on there, which we will learn later on. The sheriff wants to know what those numbers mean, and Dean's not playing ball right now. He keeps telling him that it's his high school locker combination, but there's only two numbers, so not the best lie to come up with for the start here. While Dean is dealing with his interrogation, Sam goes to interview the husband of Constance Welsh, who is the woman in white, Joseph. As Sam is talking to Joseph Welsh, we see a little bit of him acting out of character, as he's not very compassionate with Joseph Welsh, as he basically berates him into admitting that he was unfaithful to Constance, causing her to essentially kill her children by drowning them before jumping off of the bridge after realizing what she had done. We cut back to Dean over in the interrogation room as the sheriffs are pulled away because of reported shots fired over on Whiteford Road. He asks Dean if he needs to use the restroom, which he does not, so he handcuffs him to the desk and then leaves. Dean sees a paperclip in his father's journal and uses that to escape from the sheriff's department.
I always wondered about the legitimacy of being able to pick a lock with a paperclip.
Apparently, that's actually a thing. You can actually do that pretty easily with handcuffs anyways.
Okay. I mean, most handcuffs have a universal key set.
Right. From here, this is another example of the difference between the DVD version and the Netflix version. The DVD has an extra scene showing Dean climbing down the fire escape from the sheriff's office, where you actually see him with a gun belt around his arm, because he later does show up with a gun. And when I originally watched this, I always wondered where he got that from, since all the weapons would be locked in the trunk. But we see in the scene, he just stole it from the police department. We cut back to Sam in the Impala as he gets a call from Dean, thanking him for calling in that fake report of shots fired, which is what helped him to get out of jail free.
Yep.
During this time, Sam has a literal run-in with the woman in white. She appears in the back of the Impala and asks Sam to take her home, and when he refuses, she just decides to take herself home as she locks the car, takes over the Impala, and starts driving herself, becoming a literal backseat driver. Once they get to the house, Sam lets Constance know that she can't kill him because he's not going to be unfaithful to his girlfriend, and she basically just responds with, "Nah, you will be," and proceeds to try to kill him anyways. At this point, Dean just appears out of nowhere and shoots Constance with a regular gun, causing her to disappear. It's supernatural.
Well, I mean, we haven't really been introduced to the whole salt trope, the iron trope. It's just kind of like get her off trope.
But not that way. Sam was trying to not get her off.
Fair enough.
Sam uses this opportunity to throw the Impala into gear and to crash it into the house. From here, once Constance has finally been taken home, as we hear throughout the episode that she can never go home, her children appear and give her the death embrace as they literally drag her to hell, it seems. They tried to write off the silliness of Dean trying to shoot a ghost by having Sam call Dean out on it. And Dean just responds by letting Sam know that if he ruined his car, he was going to kill him. Next, we find out that the coordinates that John left to Dean were for what Sam says is Blackwater Ridge, Colorado, which is about 600 miles from where they are. Now, if you look at these coordinates, first of all, you have a very big area that you would have to search because they're very vague coordinates, but also they're nowhere near Colorado. Well, they're near Colorado, but they're actually closer to like Flagstaff, Arizona. Originally, the second episode was going to take place in Arizona, but this was the only episode that was filmed in Los Angeles. After they got picked up after the pilot, they moved to Vancouver, and there's not a lot of desert in this area, so they changed the second episode to take place in a more forested area. However, I believe they only went back and dubbed over Sam saying what the area was, because if you look at the location from around where Jericho would be and around where Blackwater Ridge would be, as that's another fictional city, it's closer to about 1,000 miles away from where they were instead of the 600. Dean wants Sam to go with him, but he wants to do his normal life. So Dean drops him off. Sam goes into his apartment and goes to lie on the bed before getting some blood dripping on his face as we come full circle to find now Sam's girlfriend on the ceiling before she bursts into flames. Dean appears out of nowhere again to literally pull Sam out of another fire. Here we have Sam and Dean back at the trunk of the Impala as Sam agrees to go with Dean, as he states to close off the episode that they have work to do. And that was our pilot episode, which started it all. It helped us to establish a lot of mainstays or staples throughout the rest of the series, and didn't necessarily play by the rules that will later be established throughout the show. But when we get into rules, I've always been curious as to the real life applications from the stuff that we see within the shows. So now what we're going to do is we're going to talk about some of those real life implications, as Brian's done some research on the woman in white to kind of let us know what the real life lore, what the inspirations for this has been.
And like Matthew was saying as well, is at the beginning of this show, right now we're looking at rules that haven't been written yet. We're looking at tools that haven't been used yet. And so as it starts to progress, we're going to start seeing things like Constance Welch being shot with a pistol and deciding to disappear. Isn't exactly something that we would normally see. Normally, you'd be using the assault shotguns or things like that. But we're not really worried about that in this portion of it. Right now, what we're looking at is that the very early seasons of Supernatural were very heavily inspired by folklore, urban legends, and mythology. And Constance Welch, the woman in white, was actually inspired by 3 different ones.
Okay.
The first one being La Llorona. La Llorona, which is more of a folklore, Mexican folklore. There is the actual woman in white, which is found more throughout all of the Eastern European continent, as well as the Disappearing Mary or the Phantom Traveler here in America. First one I wanted to talk about was La Llorona, because La Llorona probably has a much heavier influence on Constance Welch's Women in White. As La Llorona, if you know the folklore at all, was cheated on by her husband in Mexico. In revenge, she drowned her children and then committed suicide herself, but was not allowed to enter heaven's gates unless she was able to find her children. And so she now wanders the countryside wailing for her children and actually stealing the children of others and drowning them.
Oh.
She's used, not a pleasant figure, but she's used more as a boogeyman, as a way to scare children into behaving, that La Llorona will be there to get you if you're not paying attention.
Boogie woman.
Boogie woman.
Walking down the street, boogie woman. I would not like to meet the boogie woman.
But that's really the only similarities that Constance Welch shares with La Llorona. As La Llorona more goes after children. She doesn't go after cheating husbands. She doesn't go after the ones who are actually causing her pain. She's trying to find children that she can bring back to heaven so that she can get entrance into the gates.
Is this my child? Dang it!
Son of a gun. But they do borrow heavily from it. The ones that we start to see more of the tropes of Constance Welch, such as appearing in the back seat or saying things like "I can never go home," those are far more similar to America's Phantom Traveler, where individuals will be driving along the road. The urban legend goes, you're driving along the road and you pick up a hitchhiker. It's generally a beautiful woman, and she asks you to take her home. And so you start driving her home. She's giving you directions as you go. As you pull up, you actually pull up to a cemetery. You pull up to the gates of the cemetery. Generally, the story goes, they look incredulously at her like, what's going on? Are you sure this is your home? She proceeds to get out of the car, walk up to the gates, pass through the gates, and then disappear into the cemetery, generally into some kind of mist or other spooky atmosphere. Now, the most famous of these is Chicago's Disappearing Mary, where there have been several cab drivers who have said they have picked up a woman who has driven, whether to a bar or been driven to a cemetery, and then will then get out of the car and disappear without paying her fare.
Rude.
So there we have stories of suddenly cab drivers coming running into bars, screaming, there's a woman who owes me money, where'd she go? And none of the bartenders and none of the patrons saw anyone enter in.
Just tell them that Large Marge sent ya.
The final one is she's referred to as is a woman in white. Now, a woman in white actually has existed through a long portion of time in history. Generally, it is a woman that has experienced some sort of violent death at the hands of her husband, or at the hands of her lover, or at the hands of herself. Most of the time, though, these are just women that walk where they were murdered, and as they walk back and forth wailing and crying, they just cause that spooky atmosphere. Although one case in Wales, the woman in white actually was a harbinger of wealth, where a woman in white would travel down the back roads and try and beckon to people. Now, if you were like you and me and we saw a ghostly figure trying to beckon us into the woods, I would say no.
I got my salt with me.
I'm prepared. Morton Salt, demonetized.
Not a sponsor.
Oh, it's not a sponsor. Yeah, it's not a sponsor. So but one day, a gentleman actually decides to follow this woman in white into the forest, where she leads him to an old decrepit castle.
Because why not?
Yeah, because why not? After leading him through this old decrepit castle, she actually leads him to a treasure chest full of treasure and allows him to take half of it.
Oh, well, that's nice.
So he takes half of it and goes back home, but after a little bit of time of thinking, he decides that he's going to go back for more of the treasure. As he goes back for more of the treasure, the woman in white reappears in the woods and attacks him on the way home. Her fingers elongate into claws, and she rakes at his face and back.
Huh.
He's able to get home and is able to escape with all the rest of his wealth, but then falls gravely, gravely ill and suffers until he's finally able to admit his greed. And once he admits his greed, he is able to die.
Yeah.
Which is really the only time that we see a woman in white actually taking an active part in murdering somebody. Generally speaking, they are simply spooks, or they are simply harbingers of depression, of sadness, of death that has happened once before. But as you can see with it, that doesn't really work well for the story. We need something that's more of a hostile physical threat. So when you wrap them all together, you wrap a little bit of Mexican folklore in with European urban legends, and you wrap in a little bit of American urban legend, you get this creature, as Constance Welch, that causes a lot more issues for Sam and Dean Winchester. Now the question is as a woman in white, as like a La Llorona, because they're urban legends, they're folklore, they're not meant to be defeated, they're not supposed to be killed.
Sure.
Because the especially with folklore, it's more meant to scare you, it's meant to get you to behave. You're not supposed to be able to win against La Llorona. And so the question then becomes, especially with some of the tools that Sam and Dean get later, would salt work?
I think, again, knowing further seasons on, it sounds like essentially each one of these is the spirit of a person that has been affected in some way, and kind of their go-to for spirits is salting and burning the body of that person if they're able to locate it, which is what they attempt to do. And then it sounds like kind of with the La Llorona side of it, when Sam took her home, she found her children.
Yep.
So she was able to
Pass on. Or
yeah, very violently.
Very, very violently. Well, I can't imagine drowning them was exactly peaceful.
They hugged her.
But now, is Constance Welch simply a ghost, or is she a completely other entity known as the Women in White? It's hard to tell from just this first season, from the first episode, because it's but she has all the different tropes that ghosts would later have, such as their violent death, such as being able to kind of break their rules but still operating within a rule system and only haunting a specific area. Whereas La Llorona, women in white have to stay exactly basically where they died. They have to stay in the castles where they died. They're not able to walk around. But then the disappearing Mary can kind of appear in just about anywhere. But so it looks like it's following more the lesson that we would later find out from Supernatural is more of a spirit or a ghost.
Okay. So, based off of your research and everything, you feel like they could have kind of gotten away with stopping the Woman in White the way that they did?
Yeah, I think so. Especially since that's going to track a little bit more along the La Llorona path line.
I've kind of established what I like to refer to as supernatural cheating, which is something that I call out a lot in the show, is that they like to find different ways of stopping whatever it is they're up against that doesn't necessarily follow the traditional lore. Like with it being a spirit, they're supposed to find and salt and burn the body, but they get around that by instead taking her home and using this other avenue.
Yep. Kind of almost putting her to rest.
In a different way.
Yeah. But I mean, as the seasons start to progress, as the episodes start to progress, we start seeing a little bit more structure to how the different monsters are going to start playing out. The ghost hunting becomes more about the hunt of the ghost itself, not so much like we start to establish like, oh, we just need to salt and burn the bones, and hitting them with iron and salt will buy us time.
Right.
As the season was just getting started, anything was possible.
Yeah.
So that was the first episode, The Woman in White. And that's the first episode out of, how many?
There are over 300 episodes currently.
Okay.
So join us next time as we move on to our second episode out of multiple hundreds and see where things go from there. So I guess as Sam and Dean said at the end of the episode, we've got work to do.